sitting in for Shamla this morning as we are talking practical tips for interacting with blind and visually impaired persons in everyday life. To do that, we are joined by the manager of Welfare Rehabilitation Services for the Trinidad and Tobago Blind Welfare Association, Mr. Lakhan Seepersad. Good morning, sir, and welcome to the Now.
Hi, good morning. Good morning. Thank you very much for having me.
We truly appreciate that you're joining us to give us this insight because, well, we could definitely use some tips. To kick things off, let's get into the biggest misconceptions people have about blindness and visual impairment.
Well, I think one of the biggest misconceptions is that blindness is total darkness. And we need to understand that blindness is on a spectrum. So it starts from a level of what we call a visual acuity of 20/200 or severe visual impairment, straight on to total darkness. So someone could be classified as blind, but they could still see light or still see objects around them. They might still identify big objects. They will not be able to read print or things like that.
Right.
So that is one of the biggest misconceptions, that blindness means total darkness.
Good to know. It would explain where our interactions are concerned, how we can treat people differently. So then, when meeting someone who is blind or visually impaired, what are a few respectful ways to introduce yourself and begin a conversation then?
Well, the first thing is, if we recognize persons with blindness as human beings, then common courtesies come into place. So when you meet someone who's blind, simple introduction, introduce yourself, say who you are. Don't play guessing games or say, you know this voice, who am I? Just simply identify yourself, introduce yourself, and sometimes you may meet someone who's blind for the first time, and you don't know how to get their attention. You may say, "Excuse me, sir, with the white cane," or "Excuse me, sir, ma'am, with the white cane. My name is Lakhan Seepersad. How are you? Introduce yourself, because if you don't do that, then how can you have effective communication?
Absolutely. As simple as that. Now, many people want to help but aren't sure how. What are some of the do's or don'ts when offering assistance?
So, again, it's common courtesy. If you want to assist someone who's blind, vision impaired, you should indicate such to them. You may see someone in walking the street, for example, and you're telling yourself they need help, or they stand up at the side of the curb waiting to cross the street. Well, you're assuming they're waiting to cross the street because they maybe are standing there waiting for a vehicle, waiting for someone. And there was this common one that happened to a visually impaired person in Trinidad. They were standing up at the corner of South Key there by the traffic lights, and the person automatically assumed they wanted to cross the street, and they want to say, "Oh, ma'am, you want to cross the street?" and took their hand and they started to walk across South Key there, end up on the other side of the road and say, "Okay then," and leave them and go on. And this person was just waiting on someone coming from City 8 and stand up at the corner there by the lights and waiting for the person.
Right.
So the best way to help is to ask, "How can I help you?" "Excuse me, ma'am, sir, do you need any assistance? How can I help you?" And the person who is blind or visually impaired is the best person to tell you how they can be helped.
Absolutely. Especially now that we have context where there's a range, the level of assistance that might be required is different. So it certainly is the simplest way to start things off. Let's talk about everyday interactions though, like in the bank, in a restaurant, or in public transport. What are small changes that can make a big difference in accessibility?
Communication. You see, persons who are blind and visually impaired, another myth is that we hear more than other persons. That's not true. We depend on our hearing more, and simple communication works fine. So, for example, being specific with instructions. Please, you're coming onto the bus. There's 3 steps. Step up, when you enter the bus, then turn right and proceed down the lane. Or entering a restaurant. As you enter, there is a chair and desk to your left, and then you enter the dining area on your right. Be specific with instructions is one of the best ways. For persons who may be on the spectrum, well, of course, who have low vision of some sight, high visibility colors is nice, access to information. You have a menu, you may have a QR code, we could scan it on our phones and read your menus, or you may have a braille menu, or you may have a large print menu, I don't know. um, those are things that could be helpful for someone entering a space. You go into a government building, you go into an office space, um, proper directions. You not walk down the corridor and you'll see a door with Mr. James' name on it. You knock on that door. No, you walk down the corridor, three doors down on your right. That's the door you're going to. So proper communication, specific directions, left, right, you know, those things are important when communicating and making a simple trip to institution or office, trip on the bus. A simple way of communicating makes the whole experience very, way more enjoyable.
I'm hearing a common thread that is weaved throughout this conversation, but I will still ask how we as a society can support independence for persons who are blind or visually impaired, rather than unintentionally limiting it.
Well, it starts with everyone at their own home, and their own space, by recognizing persons who are blind and visually impaired are human beings too. And what you want for yourself, you should want for others.
Absolutely.
So you want to go down Port of Spain and have to shop in the stores in Port of Spain. You want to walk on a pavement that is accessible, that is safe, it's free from obstacles and so on. So to the person who's blind and visually impaired. And if we all see what it is we want for ourselves and then implement it for other persons, then it'll be so much easier. And the main trend would have been communicating with persons who blind and visually impaired, let them know what or how can you help them and so on.
Right.
Remember, persons who are blind and visually impaired use more audio cues. They don't use visual cues. So you have something selling, you stand up there and they there to get assistance. You need to interact with them, you need to speak with them, you need to just describe things to them. I mean, there's the technology. We could take out our phones and use the technology and find everything for ourselves. But then what's the sense you there for? There's no interaction with the human being who's there.
And I suppose that
So,
extends on the next question or final question I'm thinking of, because that describes the role that we as individuals, communities and businesses, even the media, can play in terms of making sure that there is inclusion fostered with persons who are visually impaired or blind altogether. Am I correct?
correct, yes. Because presently we have some conversation taking place in society with different laws and policies and processes.
Right.
And a lot of them is being drafted and taken into consideration, but no one is considering the person who's blind. The most recent one, and let's touch on it briefly, is the Stand Your Ground legislation. But how do a person who's blind identify the police? How do we know it's police coming outside the door? So if we react, we didn't react wrongly. And that's just a thought provoking statement I made there for persons to think about it. Because when we're doing something, we need to understand it from the other person's perspective as well.
Absolutely. Well, you've given us some food for thought and tips that we can definitely put into action. But are there any finals that you'd like to add to that list that we can make, well, a better experience for us both, visually impaired and those who are not?
I think we need to first recognize that a person who is blind and visually impaired is not totally blind. That's what we started off with. There are some persons who have low vision, some persons who's totally dark. Some people who are low vision don't even use a white cane, but you can recognize them by the way they observe things, the way they look at items. They hold it very close to their faces, to their eyes when they're trying to view something, or they stare at something much longer than necessary. And rather than trying to say that's a scamp, he's a smart man, he played it blind, things like that, why not try to understand what's happening with them? And they themselves probably trying to understand what's going on with them too. And they need help. And if they do need help, they should contact us at the Trinidad and Tobago Blind Welfare Association for rehabilitation services and help on in a way that they could with dignity cope with their blindness.
Mr. Seepersad, we really appreciate you joining us this morning, certainly giving us things that we could use as we continue to lend our support to our blind and visually impaired friends. Thank you so much for joining us today.
You're very welcome. Thanks a lot for having me.
Of course, Mr. Lakhan Seepersad, the manager of the Welfare Rehabilitation Services at the Trinidad and Tobago Blind Welfare Association, giving us tips on how we can interact with blind and visually impaired persons in everyday life. We'll be back with more that you could use after these messages here on The Lounge.